Hi there. A question could be asked: what do Gnostics do? What could they do? What should they do? And I think the answer to this would depend a lot on what type of Gnosticism was being practiced and what emphasis was being placed on different areas of interest as far as a Gnostic is concerned. Uh, I think the role of Christ might be something which is emphasized by some Gnostics and perhaps not others. So the Gnostic church, if it was one, would follow basically the Orthodox Catholic calendar, I would suggest, pretty much, because it does emphasize the Christ and the I don't know, the different reflections of Christ over the ecclesiastical year. So I to imagine that some Gnostic churches might be quite ritual based. As I say, follow the year, the liturgical year of Orthodox Christianity somehow. Um, that might be one way. Another way would be like perhaps more Gnostic groups would perform actual magic, and without going into the sort of weirder flavors of Gnosticism in the modern age. Um, for example, I had this idea that, and I got this idea from Enochian chess, which I haven't really sort of studied very much, but it sounds quite interesting. Anyway, the idea is that you play a game of chess against a computer, and the computer represents a demiurge, the sort of mechanistic universe that's just ruled by algorithms, that has no feeling, that has no compassion or empathy. It just A follows B. Do you know what I mean? It's like an algorithmic pattern, impersonal and mechanistic and really heartless in the literal sense of the word. So you play this game, you play your chess game against the computer, which represents a demiurge, and each of the pieces of chess pieces, well, certainly the principal ones, would represent some kind of elemental quality. So the idea basically is that if you win against the computer, depending on your how good you are, of course, and the level you set the computer at, but so you get the computer into checkmate, for example, and wherever the whatever pieces actually achieved this checkmate against your computer opponent, you could draw some kind of analogy or predict or story or predictive story, from the position of the pieces that caused the checkmate, and what pieces were involved and what moves that were involved. So I have in mind a sort of and that to predict, to use this as some kind of predictor of an outcome to a question. In following what they used to believe in the Elizabethan days, that prediction actually made things come true. So in a way, it's a magical act, because you're by predicting something, you're actually helping it to manifest in this particular world at a certain level. So that would be my idea: is use magic, as a way of predicting the moves of the demiurge and trying to uh, not outwit, but, well, perhaps to use the energy of the demiurge to your advantage, which in fact doesn't sound at all spiritual, and probably isn't actually. But anyway, I just thought I'd leave that. I don't want to sort of spend too much time on that, really. It's just sort of put it out there kind of thing. And then, of course, I have these methods which I have come up with, and these methods also follow the elements: air, fire, earth, and water, and spirit. And so you could choose any of these methods. By guided meditation, I have in my book, Grail Gnosticism, a theoretical order, magical order, which the grade practicus appears. And there is a guided meditation there for the grade of practicus, which you would do every day, where you align yourself to various elements, and you identify yourself with elements that are significant to Gnosticism, or to Grail Gnosticism at least, such as I am the breath, and then that's beginning, and then you end up with I am the Holy Grail. So there's an identification there, not identifying the ego, but the self is identified with various things, like I am the breath, I am here, present in here where I am. I am connected to all things. I am space. I am now. I am serene. And finally, I am the Holy Grail. So you just follow this as a meditation, and even a visualization, because you could visualize certain things attached to the ideas, I am breath, etc. So that'd be a kind of guided meditation, and the idea of that is to kind of align your emotional self with characteristics of the Holy Grail and with Gnosticism itself, really. So I've put that under the element of water for emotions. Under the element of fire, I have put the vision of the Holy Grail itself, which is just simply to visualize on various sigils connected with the Holy Grail, or on the actual legendary vision or legendary picture of the Holy Grail, which is the chalice itself. So, and the idea of that is to have a vision in your mind's eye of something which acts as a bridge between soul and the ineffable. So that's one thing there. And then the other one is laying on of hands, very ancient practice, of course, in Orthodox Christianity, by which a priest is ordained. And here, of course, we have the religion of all believers. So it's all you're all priests, really. So the laying on of hands is to do with the earth. It's a sort of sensual experience, whereby the sort of energy or etheric energy is passed from one person to another, not necessarily by the presiding deacon or pope or anything. Laying on of hands, you lay your hands on each other in the congregation if people were meeting in one place, so it's a kind of a physical thing. Well, it's not kind of, it is a physical ritual or demonstration or presentation of the Gnostic energies, as it were. And then finally, well, not finally, penultimately, you'd have the study of Gnostic texts and the corpus of Gnostic texts. And this would be a very, for in Kabbalah, to study the Kabbalah is itself prayerful. It is an act of piety in itself, simply to study, simply to learn the Sephiroth by heart, for example, and the whole tree of life by heart. This is a prayerful exercise. It's a way of aligning yourself to spirit, but also of acknowledging spirit and acknowledging the forces of the Sephiroth, and inspiring yourself, basically. So that would be a contemplation, a study of the Gnostic Gospels themselves, which is an intellectual exercise, sure. Well, there's two ways, in and out of context. So I suppose in context would mean an intellectual academic study of the Gnostic Gospels, cross-referencing and deciding and referencing to the to perhaps the origin of the Gospel, or to other writings of Valentius, for example, or anything, or someone like that. So an out of context would be simply to choose a verse from the Gospel of Thomas, for example, Gospel of Philip, and seek to apply that or to contemplate that verse in the light of one's life situation, for example. So that would be a contemplation, intellectual contemplation, or a contemplation referring to words, basically. And so that's one. And then the final thing to spirit is spontaneous introspection. This actually is quite interesting because it arises out of an emotional feeling, or an emotional awareness, I suppose, of the imprisonment of the soul in the lower worlds, or the world of the demiurge. And it's like the Buddha said, dukkha, dukkha, dukkha. Suffering, suffering, suffering. It would be kind of like an awareness of universal suffering, and not just of personal suffering, but of universal suffering, an awareness of the suffering of humankind and of the soul trapped in matter. And from this sort of not negative, but partly pragmatic view of oneself and humankind, not exactly depressing, but a sort of sad, a kind of a declaration of dukkha, to put it in Buddhist terms. And then from that, you'd go into a spontaneous introspection, where you would either receive a vision of the Holy Grail itself, or you would go some kind of guided meditation, or you'd think, or you'd remember a line from the Gospels or a verse. You might touch something of significant object which would represent Gnosticism in some certain way. But this would happen. The main thing is spontaneous, because you wouldn't want to make kind of an obsession out of the other elements, nor would you try to do things. You wouldn't try to have a vision of the Holy Grail, for example. It would just arise. And in fact, there's a certain connection here between the spontaneous introspection and the vision of the Holy Grail, for example. And even on the laying on of hands, you might feel something running through your fingers, and with permission, of course, you might touch somebody, and the Holy Spirit might descend on the person as a result of the laying on of hands. But it would be quite a spontaneous action on your part. And they all sort of have to have an element of spontaneity about them, all these different methods, really. So you just pick up one of the Gospels, and you begin to read, and you begin to analyze, and you begin to think and contemplate the contents of the Gospel that you've just picked up. So things would sort of fall into your hands, as it were. Rather than formal, ritualistic, we're going to do this every Sunday kind of thing. But I mean, having said that, if you're 2 or 3 people gathered together in the name of Christ, then you are permitted to carry out any of these methods, really. As a group, you study Scripture. As a group, you share the vision of the Holy Grail. As a group, you lay hands on each other. As a group, you have a guided meditation. Get somebody to guide the meditation 1 week, and then another person the next week, sort of thing. And then so you could actually do this every week if you wanted. Nice, because it forms a community of believers, which is rather strong, really, and good to do. But I mean, I'm quite Protestant about this, so there's no candles and incense, and it's all just meet in someone's house, and you just sit around in a circle, perhaps, and you go into a sort of spontaneous introspection as a group, a bit like the Society of Friends does, for example. And there's no ritual or robes or anything like that. It's just a very ordinary thing. So I hope this has given a guide to, perhaps what Gnostics do, perhaps what Gnostics should do and can do in response to the awareness of the Demiurge, or the awareness of the Holy Grail, the awareness of the ineffable supernal worlds, and the awareness of the world in which we live. As if we didn't need any awareness, it's pretty obvious, really. So these things are good to cultivate, these methods are cultivate either on an individual basis or a group basis.